welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today we're back with a guest that we had in 2025 to talk about a super fun contemporary romance. And we're back in 2026 with something of a little bit of a different flavor, but it is just as much fun, and I am so excited to be here. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me back. I'm Kate Golden, and I'm the author of Half City.
I loved this so much. And, I had also loved If Not For My Baby, which we talked about last year. And yeah, you're playing with like a very different mood and subgenre, let's say, actually. And yeah, what was it like to return to romantic fantasy after like a little stay in contemporary?
Well, in some ways, it was like, the best. It was like coming home. I definitely missed, high stakes and fantastical creatures and crafting my own rules and my own lands and magic systems and powers that be. In other ways, all those things make for challenges, self-imposed challenges. And sometimes, I was like, man, wish I could just set this in, whatever, a music hall venue or, in Austin or something. And instead, you have to put in triple the amount of work to sort of build out the world that then your characters have to inhabit. So, I think that it was, in some ways, Half City feels like a blend of my experience writing fantasy with my first trilogy, the first book of which was A Dawn of Onyx, and my experience writing contemporary with If Not For My Baby. It feels like in some ways Half City is sort of like the love child of those two things because it's got all the fantasy fun and life or death stakes and creatures and, trials, games, all those things as the series goes on, all the great stuff that I love about fantasy. But it's urban fantasy. So people can send each other a text message. We can make modern pop culture references. There's a little bit of pressure that comes off when it's not like a medieval swords and sandals kind of fantasy world. And so I really enjoyed that.
What was the inception point for this one? Was it a particular like type of character you wanted to explore, or the setting itself, or just perhaps like a theme?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was kind of a couple of things that sort of coalesced, that sort of happened at once. For one, I was writing A Dawn of Onyx and writing the Sacred Stone series, finishing that trilogy. And just, there were moments where I thought, oh, what I'd give for people to be able to hop in a car or send an email. And so I was really like, okay, the next time I write fantasy, I want it to be more contemporary, more urban. At the time, I was also watching Buffy for the very first time, which is my all-time favorite show. And yet I watched it, 4 years ago. It's crazy. But I loved it so much. And so this was very inspired by not just Buffy, but sort of like urban fantasy that I grew up on, both reading and watching, so from like Mortal Instruments to Vampire Diaries, these supernatural, these shows that felt like, and books that felt like, the blend of the sort of teen and 20 something drama that I loved, and, werewolves and vampires and demons and things that go bump in the night. And then I think also, not to speak be too personal, but at the time I was still working a full-time job doing something else, and I really wanted to be a full-time author. But, this job I had done for a long time felt very tied to my identity and my relationships. My family was in this industry. All my friends were in this business. It felt like it was what I went to college for. It felt like a big part of who I was. But deep down, I had this thing in me that I loved so much more, that brought me so much more joy, that I wasn't even really public with, because I write, under a pen name, and most of my friends and family, except for very, very closest people, didn't even know that I was doing this. And so I was sort of inspired by the idea of writing a character who in some ways was like living a double life in that way. By day, she is trying to be a lot of things for a lot of people. And by night, she does the things she really loves, but she carries some like shame around it. Not that there's anything shameful about writing at all, but at the time it felt like giving up the thing I had committed my life to. That felt sort of shameful to me, or like failure or something. So a little bit therapy, a little bit homage to my favorite genres, and a little bit of like an answer to the series that I had been writing at the time.
That's so interesting. And something that I think that this book shares sort of with the Buffyverse is that it's very funny and like snarky, if we want to use that word in places, but it's not just like snark for snark's sake. Like it's built into characters and it's like a defense mechanism or it's like a way to
Sure.
connect or to avoid things or so it's like character informed humor, if that makes sense.
Oh, that is the highest compliment. I mean, that's one of the things I love most about Buffy is that it really is like the tone of that show is unmatched. It is so emotional. Stakes are so high. There's real, out of the frying pan into the fire, kind of constantly going from one perilous situation to another. And also, it's like great commentary on being a teen and being in college and being in your early 20s, experiencing, you sort of grow with Buffy. And it's really funny. And it's really kind of like life, where even when things are absolutely terrible, sometimes like you have to laugh, and you're so right about character driven comedy. It's like Xander is funny in a defense mechanism way. Willow is funny because you're kind of laughing at her in a loving way or like with her and her foibles and her mistakes and whatever, and like Buffy is purposefully snarky. Like there is sort of it's each dependent on the character. And I that is like the highest compliment of all time.
Oh, nice. Well, it's true. So, speaking of snark, let's talk a little bit about Viv, your protagonist. She's really great. I really would love to know what goes into shaping her as a character, especially when you need an arc for a character that has to, how do I put this, fit within one book and then also like the wider scope you have planned, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, totally. No, that's a really good question. I mean, crafting Viv again was in many ways kind of like she's sort of like the anti Arwen, who was the main character of the first series that I wrote. Arwen, who is, endlessly patient, incredibly optimistic, just like overwhelming with, or like bubbling over with warmth. Everyone she meets, she's like, I'm going to assume the best in this person, or I'm going to go out of my way to help this stranger. She sort of lives her life like that. And I don't know, I was very interested in trying to do something totally different. And I think Viv and Arwen share some very important qualities, like I respect them equally, but they're pretty vastly different. And that was just sort of a fun, internal challenge for me. I wanted to write someone that was prickly and sort of had a black cat energy and took a lot of work to get to know, and someone that sort of assumed most people were out to get her because that's what life had sort of shown her thus far. She physically is fighting things that are out to get her on a daily basis since she was a kid. So that fight or flight is kind of like ingrained in her. And she, is carrying a lot of trauma. She has been through some really awful things and not worked through them in a way that I think has done her such a service. And so, it's a really good question about sort of setting up the arc for one book and also building towards an arc for the whole series. My hope, and I don't think this is a spoiler of any kind, is that, in the first book, maybe we're growing towards, I'm hoping, if I did my job correctly, some kind of self-acceptance. When you first meet her, she probably, I think deep down has a lot of self-loathing. And I hope by the end of the book, her experiences going to Harker, this school for demon slayers, meeting this demon and, beginning a relationship with him, delving into these mysteries, making these friends, going through this journey. I hope by the end of the first book, she's kind of learning to accept who she is. But self-acceptance is not self-love. Those are very different things, kind of like grinning and bearing it and being like, this is who I am. I guess I'm going to have to deal with it is very different than being like, this is who I am and what a gift and how wonderful. And I'm grateful, gratitude for this life and to be me. And so I hope I can build her to that point by the end of the series.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And I really appreciate that distinction between self-acceptance and self-love. It sort of like mirrors that difference between like tolerance and acceptance, right? Like
Yeah.
we can tolerate something, but that's not really like the warmest way to
Yeah.
connect.
Yeah, totally. Or it's like, like in therapy, I'm a big fan of therapy. And sometimes you're like, okay, I've got this problem. And kind of like step one is just even knowing you have the problem. And then you kind of notice it all the time. And then you know what to do to fix it, but it doesn't happen overnight. And then it's like not till months or even sometimes years later, that you're like, oh, this is not plaguing me anymore. But like there's space between those things. So it's like she's got to sort of understand herself before she can even begin to really love herself. It's a journey.
Mm. Yeah, and it's very much speaking from the point of view of somebody who has done therapy. There's a difference between like learning those principles and like really internalizing them.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So I do want to talk about Reed, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about the mystery elements, if we can, in the
Sure.
vaguest terms possible. So we don't
Yeah.
spoil
Totally.
anything for anybody. But Viv is investigating her father's death. That's what brings her to the academy. When you are crafting a mystery that's also going to be combined like with a romantic plot line, how do you balance like plotting character development? And how do you know like what takes precedence in a scene? It's a lot to think about at once because th those are very two different kinds of very high stakes, you know?
Totally. Oh my gosh, another really great question. I'm not sure when I like have a solid answer for you on because I'm still figuring it out as I go. And I think every book is different.
Mm.
But I think in general, that's kind of the big question around romantasy because it is sort of pitched as this idea. If you pick up a romantasy book, whether that's urban fantasy or that is, whatever kind of romantasy it is, you're getting kind of like half romance novel. You want all of the great romantic tropes and half like big epic high fantasy. Again, whether that's urban or it's vampires or it's pirates or it's dystopian or whatever. I'm kind of like, for the sake of the question, generalizing them all. But I think that that is really tough. And I don't think there's a ton of other genres in books, at least, that do that quite as much. If you pick up a great paperback thriller, it's not like also going to be equal parts. It might be an, adventure. It might have a little bit of mystery, whatever, but it's not going to be like this is equal parts, also this other thing. So I think, it's a very hard balance to strike. And the best that I can do is try to always think of myself as like a reader. Like, Stephen King talks about like the ideal reader. Like when you write the book, you're writing sometimes, or like oftentimes for like one person you're imagining reading the book. He says always, it's his wife. For me, it's usually my husband. But sometimes, I hope this is not so egocentric. Sometimes it's me. It's like I am the ideal reader. I write the book and then I get to read this book that at one point I really hoped existed and now it exists. And so I try to think, like, what am I dying to have happen next? So when I finish a chapter, am I just like chomping at the bit to see these two characters have a romantically charged, sexually charged, flirtatious interaction? Am I just dying to get the next clue for this mystery? Like, I think you kind of have to follow what your reader is going to want next because there's nothing worse than you're reading a book and it's like the author's following a thread that you're not as engrossed in. So I find it comes in little kind of like bursts or bubbles. You have like a handful of chapters that are really kind of character focused, and the mystery or the sort of fantasy device comes a little bit second. And then naturally, your characters are kind of driven towards because they've solved this thing romantically, or because they've made this leap, or they've been driven apart in opposite directions romantically. So now they've got to go on their own journeys to handle the fantasy plot. It sort of is like it ebbs and flows in that way. I don't know if that's a good answer, but I guess it's sort of like trusting your characters and also like allowing yourself to think like a reader.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I think it also can speak to like the ways in which the romance and the fantasy mystery sort of elements can like dance around each other and inform each other.
Totally. Totally.
Because they're depending on what's happening in a scene and like where the relationship is at, the ongoing investigation can either be like a source of connection or one of like a
Mhm.
rupture and obstacle.
Yeah.
So, mm.
Great point. And I think also there's like a little bit of like the expectations of the genre, which you can always subvert and that can be really fun. But, it's like I find, at least with fantasy, you really want to hook your reader with some kind of like fantasy hook from the beginning. So, in A Dawn of Onyx, it's this character being kidnapped and taken or captive to, a distant, far off dark kingdom. That's not a romantic plot line. Of course, it becomes one, but it is, from the from chapter, whatever it is, it's a fantasy plot line. And kind of same thing here, it's our main character, Viv, who's been hunting demons alone her whole life, being told by a dark, mysterious stranger that there's a school for demon hunters just like her and to attend. And of course, she's interested in finding out what happened to her father, who also went to this school. So, it's like you need the kind of fantasy or mystery or like plotty hook, sort of to get the reader into it. Then, sort of like by the time you get to sort of like the fun and games section, if you will, if you're using sort of like the save the cat terminology, you sort of want to you want to like up all the romantic fun and the flirtation, because at least for me, so much of my favorite part about reading romance novels, fantasy or otherwise, is the will they, won't they? It's not the moment they get together. It's like everything before that. And then, of course, you want your big finale to be like fantasy, 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 because that's where you're going to get the greatest stakes. So I think there's also just like a natural kind of rhythm to it.
Speaking of the fantasy elements, I'd love to know about your world building process, building, as it were, the half city itself. What goes into constructing a fantasy city and like your magic system? And like what kind of, I guess, this question is going to get too big, but like
No, that's okay.
what purpose the magic serves for you? Like, is it like more than set decoration, right? Like, is there
Yeah.
like an emotional sort of expressiveness to it? Like, how does it work for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, I think it kind of starts with the premise. I really wanted to write about a college where, like, if Buffy and like the Winchester brothers and like, like if all these characters we love throughout history throughout had to like go be trained in how to hunt the things that go bump in the night, but it looked like, this, the Yale from Ninth House, like that version of Yale. Well, like, what does that look like? And so kind of building around that like inherent concept, you have to craft a magic system from there. So you've obviously got the hunters, if you will, and then you have all of the things that they hunt. So that was sort of like the first delineation was like, okay, I needed the good guys and the bad guys. And then, populating the world with just the things that I find most fun. I love vampires and werewolves and witches and mermaids and dragons and ogres. Like I love creatures of all shapes and sizes. I love doing research on them. I've read all the books, like in that, not just fantasy books that have these characters in it, but like those, old like coffee table books that are like creatures from A to Z. Like I love stuff like that. So you get to sort of populate the world. And then as you begin crafting your story, in some ways, the world building like informs your characters. So for example, I felt it was really important that Viv feel like an outsider, even when she's surrounded by ostensibly people that are just like her. So I had to make her sort of a very specific type of hunter that is thought to be extinct, that has been taken out, many years ago, and she has to keep this deadly secret. So then crafting, sort of how did those people exist? Who got rid of them? The sort of the world building kind of does the job itself. That's at least as far as like the magic system. As far as the actual city, that was really just an homage to New York. I mean, I went to NYU. I loved living in New York. I miss it all the time. And every time I would go back to the city for work, I would think, I really want to write a book set in New York City. Like, I want to describe, I want to like inhabit these, brownstones and these busy streets and the skyscrapers and the taxis and the bodegas. Like, I miss what the city smells like and looks like. But obviously, as I started working on this, it became very clear that I didn't want to write in our actual New York City. I wanted to write like a Gotham City, kind of like a reimagined version of New York. And then, of course, like, the creativity, the creative bug takes hold, and you're like, and the whole thing is bisected by like a gate to the underworld, like, haha. And then you like do that. So maybe that got a little I got a little away from me, but that's more so like fantasy wish fulfillment, like what is this gritty fun version of New York that I can make up in my head.
All right, that's great. So I also went to NYU, so like,
Oh yeah,
yay.
we talked about this last time, I remember.
Yeah, that's right. Go Violets or whatever our
Yes, totally.
non-existent sports teams were.
Yeah, we're so sporty us and
Yeah.
like
And yeah, I really did feel like New York. And I feel like, there's something to be said also about like, I don't know, the various layers of like isolation that Viv is feeling because like she's alienated within her family, within this school environment now. And like New York is great because you can like meet random people all the time and like have like an amazing incident at any moment. But if
Mhm.
you're not like in a great mood, it can also feel very isolating, and you could feel
Oh yeah.
that aloneness can feel very amplified. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In some ways, it's like a very high stakes city. You know what I mean? It's like the highs are high, but the lows are really low. Like having a terrible day in New York City, especially like if it's really cold or really, really hot. I mean, that's like brutal. That's a lot worse than I live in Los Angeles, which is like always pretty sunny and like, big wide open streets and like, I don't know. A lot of people have a lot of feelings about LA, but I happen to love LA. It's a very different experience having a bad day on like a beautiful sunny day in Los Angeles and you're right by the beach. It's different.
Oh, I imagine. Yeah, there's a very, very different, yeah, mise en scène.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Wow. So, we don't want to spoil any upcoming mysteries for our listeners, but do you have any hints of what lies ahead for Viv and Reed? I didn't even get to talk about Reed yet. So,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
Well, okay, things that lie ahead without giving spoilers is difficult, and I'm really bad at not spoiling my own books. But I will say the mysteries that we set up in book one, hopefully I love a cliffhanger because I don't want to forget or frankly be disinterested and not get the second book in a series, then I never finish it. So again, thinking like a reader, I'm big on the cliffhangers, especially because these books, it's a trilogy and they don't come out too far away from one another. But I hope that sort of the central mystery that is set up in the first book is solved with enough satisfaction that you're not like, wait, what's even happening by the time you finish the first book. However, it is only the beginning of what sort of is yet to come over the next two books. I would say even more sort of like personally for Viv than sort of as far as like this specific mystery in this school. But I will leave it at that and I'll be good and not spoil my whole my whole book series.
That was well maneuvered. So,
Oh, thank
that's
you.
good.
Thank you so much.
I'm just curious, sort of off the cuff, like what is more intimidating for you, like a second or a third volume? Like, is it harder to get yourself past the messy middle, or is it harder to bring it all to an end?
Oh my God, the third is the worst always. I mean, I say always, I've done this twice, but yeah, the second one is usually where I feel like I hit my stride, which is always sad because no matter what your book is, who you are, Sarah Maas to, Stephen King to anybody, you're never going to have as many readers read the second book as you will the first. That's just like the physics of it because one comes out first and you need to read the first one to read the second one, whatever. But I always feel like the second one is where I kind of hit my stride because you don't have to do the same amount of world building. You've already set up these characters. You get to really dig in. Often there's things I really want to do, but it doesn't make sense to do them in the first book. So those ideas always get kicked to the second book. So I always come into the second one with so many ideas. Third one is just so hard for me because it's really the back half of the third is always really hard because there are always lots of threads and I stress about tying them up neatly, but not too neatly. What makes something bittersweet? What makes something feel, cloying or twee if it's all too perfect, but also I like a happy ending. So, I have to fight those instincts sometimes to like partner everybody up and give everybody everything they want. And I think it's just hard saying goodbye and ending something. I don't even like to watch the last episode of my favorite TV shows. So it's really, really hard to finish a book. Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited to see where it goes, and I thank you for taking the time to talk to us and our listeners. I'm so excited to recommend this to folks.
Of course. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
No problem. All right, listeners. So here is your homework. You're going to check out Half City. It is such a good read, and you're going to be so pumped for the second one at the end. It's just like it is a mwah of a cliffhanger. It's
Oh my gosh.
beautiful. So all right. So it'll be out in the world as you hear this. So head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for books. All right. It is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.